fine.
You have plenty of light on this?
43. All right.
Okay, thank you, sir.
Yeah, you're recording.
Okay. Do you want that door shut or not?
We don't.
Okay. My name is John Wilcox, and this is Redeeming the Fathers of America. I wish to preface the following teaching as something that will likely only scratch the surface of a just and thorough treatment, which is due this subject. As I began to dive into this journey, my heart was deeply stirred with various emotions, and a hunger developed. It must be noted here that from the start of my research into the lives of Black Americans in the 17 and 1800s, that I was appalled by the shameful treatment and enslavement they suffered, especially when it came by the hands of the colonists who had sacrificed so much to obtain their own religious freedom from the tyrannical grip of Great Britain. It was not long, and I witnessed a tightening in my gut. I felt a deep sadness, anger, and even outrage at how one human being could treat another in such a demeaning, disrespectful, and dishonoring manner. In the midst of this sorrow, however, something quite unexpected happened. There was a sense of warmth, of hope, gratitude, and excitement as I began to see the fortitude and character of those who were forced into slavery, yet refused to allow their captivity to define their identity. Make no mistake, there should be no pleasure in the enslavement of another human being. As a believer in Christ, I hold to a firm belief that all men and women are created in the image of God. And although there is a concept of being indentured in the Bible, much of our early history was more than that. My desire in presenting this lesson is to examine the good, the bad, and the ugly parts of our American history. It is with the utmost sincerity that I have purposed to examine what occurred along the timeline of this country's founding and discover just how many lives of men, women, and children of all nationalities and races affected the founding of this nation through the American Revolution. I trust that each person hearing or reading this will not judge history until it has been fully reviewed. Many of us have taken the time to research and address the contributions of our English and European ancestors, those who risked it all to settle in what would become known as New England. However, it is a grave lapse of judgment when we fail to consider all peoples, including but not limited to blacks, Indians, whites, both male and female. It was difficult for me to determine a starting place. Should I write about those Black Americans who were enslaved or free? What about men of the clergy? Who among these men and women were writers of history, merchants, scientists, or inventors? How many served as soldiers during the Revolutionary War, or on land or on sea? The list grew beyond my imagination. At some point, a parallel snapped into my consciousness. It was that of Hebrews 11:32, which reads, "And what more shall I say? For time will fail me if I tell of Gideon, Barak, Samson, Jephthah, or David, and Samuel and the prophets." How many of these courageous Americans could be likened to those who were mentioned in the text of Hebrews chapter 11? Those who walked in faith, trusting God for protection and deliverance that He had promised them. The great number of blacks who achieved vast and varied exploits in the cause of our nation's liberty should be stimulating to any student of history, and it presents a picture of just how many have been forgotten. With that, I will begin this presentation of some of our Black American founding fathers. Let us begin with Lemuel Haynes. Lemuel was born in West Hartford, Connecticut on July 18, 1753. His mother was a Scottish indentured servant and his father an enslaved Black American. Lemuel's parents lived on the plantation of John Haynes. His parents abandoned their infant, and at 5 months of age, he was carried to Granville, Massachusetts, where he became the servant of Deacon David Rose. Lemuel's education was that of a common school in Granville, but he gleaned a great deal of his learning from the Rose home. His mind keenly developed as a result of years of biblical training, especially through the hearing of psalms and contemporary sermons. It was during the Saturday evening family gatherings where Lemuel would recite a familiar sermon of the church. At such an occasion, Lemuel recognized the call of God to preach the gospel, and not long after, he began to write his own sermons. In 1774, after 21 years of service to Deacon Rose, Lemuel was free of his indenture. He built a stone cottage across the road from his family and enlisted in the Minutemen. These men were mostly farmers who would respond at a moment's notice to military duty. And in April 1775, one day after the Battle of Lexington and Concord, Haynes enlisted as a private under Captain Lebbeus Ball's militia and joined the Colonial Army at the Siege of Boston. He later joined with Ethan Allen's Green Mountain Boys, and in 1776, he enlisted to march under Lieutenant General Timothy Robinson, who led a campaign to reinforce the Northern Army. After serving in the militia, Haynes returned to his home in Granville, where he took up farming and the study of theology. As he was preparing for ministry, Lemuel desired for greater understanding of the Bible and sought to study Latin under Reverend Daniel Farrand of New Canaan, Connecticut. 3 months later, Lemuel set out for Wintonbury, now Bloomfield, Connecticut, where Reverend William Bradford invited him to study the Greek language. In November of 1780, he was examined by a team of ministers who licensed Lemuel Haynes to the ministry. Immediately, he was invited to pastor the congregation of Middle Granville, making Haynes the first Black American to serve as a pastor of a white congregation. 5 years later, he was officially ordained a minister of the Congregational Church in Litchfield County, Connecticut, thus becoming the first Black ordained minister to be set aside for the service of the gospel in all of North America. Under the preaching of Lemuel Haynes, the congregation grew to a packed house within 2 years. But not all congregants were happy with the Black preacher. Their determined disrespect forced Haynes to leave Torrington, Connecticut, to seek another pulpit. In those days, circuit preaching was common, and in the fall of 1787, Lemuel found himself serving such a circuit in the frontier settlements of Vermont. Soon he was asked to preach at the West Parish congregation in Rutland. It was here that he served for 30 years, growing the church from 46 to over 300. Haynes continued to preach in various area villages, many of which he helped organize. His teaching and preaching abilities became known far and wide. As a result, he was awarded an honorary Master of Arts degree by Middlebury College in 1804, making him the first Black man in America to receive a master's degree. In 1809, he was appointed Field Secretary of the Vermont Missionary Society, and in 1814, Lemuel served as a delegate to the General Convention of Ministers in Vermont and represented the colony at the General Association meeting in Connecticut. This nation owes a debt of gratitude to this deeply devoted patriot, a man of service to his country and to the church. Lemuel Haynes paved the way for many black Americans in the military, in education, and in the ministry. As a man of hunger for learning, Haynes began to involve himself in politics. During his years of service at Rutland, he would express those views from the pulpit. Soon the Washington Benevolent Society began to react to his freedom in the pulpit and brought him much conflict, resulting in his term at Rutland ending in 1818. This did not minimize the demand for Lemuel's preaching, and he was never without a pulpit on the Sabbath. He continued to roam from village to village across Vermont until age 65, when he was asked to serve the church in Manchester, which he served for the next 3 years. The year was 1822. At the age of 69, Lemuel Haynes was asked to pastor a church in South Granville, New York. He served 11 years in this community, where, esteemed by many, he continued to preach, growing the church and providing spiritual counseling. On September 28, 1833, Lemuel Haynes passed away, leaving his wife, Elizabeth, who joined him 3 years later. Among the many patriots was a man named Cyrus Bustle, who was born in 1732 to an English lawyer and a slave mother. Since the status of the child followed the mother, he became a slave. Cyrus was trained by a baker named Thomas Pryor, a Quaker, who liberated Cyrus in 1769 at age 36. He joined approximately 104 other enslaved black Americans that were manumitted by the Society of Friends in Burlington from 1763 to 1796. As a free man, Cyrus Bustle operated a successful baking business for many years. During the Revolutionary War, Cyrus baked bread for the Continental troops and was awarded for his service by General George Washington. After the war, Cyrus Bustle and his wife Elizabeth Morey, who was born of mixed race by a European-American father and a Delaware Indian mother, moved to Philadelphia. In their new home, they raised their 8 children and attended Quaker meetings. Even though there is no record of Cyrus joining the Society of Friends, Cyrus remained actively involved with them until his death in 1806. Cyrus Bustle became a member of the Free African Society, which began in 1787. He was one of the first to contribute funds for starting St. Thomas's African Episcopal Church in 1792. And his family was actively involved in the Underground Railroad in Philadelphia. In 1797, Cyrus retired from his baking business and built a house at 3rd and Green Street, where he opened a school for black children in 1803. Cyrus Bustle passed away in 1806. Another influential man was Peter Salem. Peter was born in 1750 to a slave in Framingham, Massachusetts. His parents' names are unknown. Peter's owner was the New England Army Captain Jeremy Belknap, who apparently named Peter after his former residence in Salem, Massachusetts. As a result of the colony's long history of slavery, dating back to the 1620s, and various insurrections by blacks, the colony made it illegal for them to serve in the military. However, in 1775, the increasing threat by British naval and foot soldiers began to shift public opinion. The Massachusetts Committee of Safety weighed the rumors of slave uprisings against the safety of their families and their husbands off defending the colony against the British invading. It became expedient for the colonies to consider putting every able-bodied man to the task of defending their homes and livelihoods. So when the Committee of Safety met in May of 1775, the decision was made to allow only free blacks to serve. Captain Belknap sold Peter to Major Lawson Buckminster around 1775. Buckminster in turn freed him, thus allowing Peter the choice of serving in the militia. Peter didn't hesitate, enlisting and serving under Captain Simon Eggles's company, which were special trained Minutemen forces. Salem fought as one of the few black Minutemen and was quickly ranked among the heroes when he fought at the Battle of Concord on April 19, 1775. Just 1 week later, he enlisted under Colonel Nixon's 5th Massachusetts Regiment. 2 months later, Peter Salem served with Captain Drury's company when the British invaded Boston, and the first major battle of the war ensued at the Battle of Bunker Hill. The date was June 17, 1775, when the order was given by British General William Howe to open fire on the colonists. 3 times the British fired in hopes of driving the colonists northward across Bunker Hill. When the shooting ceased, 400 dead, wounded Americans and more than 1,000 British soldiers lay on the ground. When Major John Pitcairn called his British troops to charge, Peter Salem, one of the Continental Army's noteworthy sharpshooters, took aim, shooting the major through, knocking him off his horse to his death. Other little-known facts about Peter Salem included his life as a spy, risking much to bring valuable military information to the Continental Army. Salem also re-enlisted in 1776 and fought at Saratoga and Stony Point. The Battle of Saratoga occurred after a British general, Burgoyne, devised a plan to attack the colonies from Canada, moving southward. He was to be joined by Sir William Howe off the coast, but Howe decided to move his ships southward and attack Philadelphia. This divided force eventually led to a major turning point in the war. The Battle of Stony Point took place on July 16, 1779, and involved a nighttime attack by a highly trained select group of soldiers under George Washington's command. This strategic assault defeated the British and opened a valuable crossing used later in the war. Here are a couple of notes regarding the work of spies in the American Revolution. First, that both sides relied on messages and battle plans gained through the use of spies. Second, their messages came through enemy lines in creative ways. Some were even sewn into buttons on their uniforms. They also used coded messages, invisible ink, or what was known as mask letters. It took a discerning military mind to determine whether these messages were legitimate intelligence or merely a means of luring the opposing army into a trap. One such spy was American James Armistead. James was born in 1760 Virginia as a slave to William Armistead. In 1781, he gained the consent of his owner and was stationed to serve under Marquis de Lafayette, the commander of the French forces allied with the Continental Army. James Armistead worked as a spy, infiltrating British General Charles Cornwallis's headquarters, posing as a runaway slave. Not only did Cornwallis accept him as a British spy, but Benedict Arnold was so convinced that Armistead was on the side of the British that he would use him to lead British troops through unfamiliar roads. The traitor Arnold's trust in Armistead eventually led to his capture. Armistead fed phony information to the British supplied by Lafayette. In light of his station as a spy, he became aware of enemy troop movements. One particular critical set of events was revealed and passed from Armistead to Lafayette, leading up to the July 1781 marshalling of British forces at Yorktown. Armistead's information was confirmed by others, and Lafayette relayed word to General Washington in New York. This information led to the pivotal engagement of American and French forces against the British and brought about the surrender of General Cornwallis on October 19, 1781. The dangerous and selfless acts of courage by James Armistead should have immediately and grandly been rewarded. Instead, under the laws that at that time listed him as a slave, more specifically as a slave spy and not a slave soldier. This travesty of justice occurred as a result of an emancipation law passed in 1782 and forced this Revolutionary War hero to return to his owner, William Armistead. In 1784, the Marquis de Lafayette issued a written testimony of Armistead's service during the war. It read as follows: "This is to certify that the bearer by the name of James has done essential services to me while I had the honor to command in this state. His intelligence from the enemy's camp were industriously collected and most faithfully delivered. He perfectly acquitted himself with some important commissions I gave him, and appears to me entitled to every reward his situation can admit of." James was serving William Armistead in the Virginia Assembly at this time, and William added his voice to the Marquis's petition that James be granted his independence. It took over 2 years, but on January 9, 1787, the Virginia Assembly granted this petition. In a show of gratitude to his friend and comrade in service, during his enlistment in the Continental Army, James added Lafayette's surname to his name and became James Armistead Lafayette. Upon obtaining his freedom, James moved to New Kent County, Virginia, where he purchased 40 acres of land, married, and started farming. In gratitude for his service, the state of Virginia granted James Armistead Lafayette an annual pension of $40. History records a return trip to America for the famous General Marquis de Lafayette in 1824. Upon his arrival, he was greeted by a thankful crowd of thousands of people as he toured the states. But something unforgettable happened when the Marquis visited Virginia. Looking across the crowd, he spotted James Armistead Lafayette, jumped off his carriage, and embraced his dear friend. What a reunion that must have been for these men, and what a witness to the peoples of Virginia. James Armistead Lafayette, a courageous American patriot, served his country with honor and distinction, and passed on August 9, 1830. Another American military hero who served as a spy during the Revolutionary War was Saul Matthews. Saul was a slave when he enlisted as a soldier under Colonel Josiah Parker, a commander in the Virginia militia. Colonel Parker said that Matthews deserves the applause of his country for his bravery. It was also reported that on one occasion, Saul brought back military secrets of such value that Colonel Parker decided that Matthews should turn around and guide a party under his command right into the British garrison, which was in the vicinity of Portsmouth. In 1781, British General Lord Cornwallis and his troops occupied Portsmouth, Virginia. Colonel Parker sent Saul into British camps several times on spying missions. Saul faced great danger, but always returned with important information about British troop positions and movements. Saul was praised by leaders such as General Nathanael Greene and Baron Frederick von Steuben. Yet after the war, he was returned to slavery for nearly 10 years. It was not until 1792 that he successfully petitioned the Virginia General Assembly for his freedom. Another of our black founders was a man named Charles Bowles, who was born in Boston in 1761. His father was a black slave. His mother was a daughter of the celebrated Colonel Daniel Morgan, who was distinguished as an officer in the Rifle Corps of the American Army. Apparently, Bowles spent little time growing up with his father, and early in his childhood, he was placed in the care of Mr. Jones of Lunenburg, Massachusetts. At age 12, Mr. Jones passed away. Charles was then placed in the family of a Tory, a name given to those who believed in divine right, the king's prerogative, and hereditary succession. Charles grew discontented with the finer things of life awarded him as the grandson of a colonel, and his heart would not give him peace while others served their country. At the age of 14, he enlisted in the Continental Army and was assigned as a waiter to an officer of the colonial artillery. This young boy suffered many horrors of war, blood and carnage that turned many older men's stomachs. 2 years later, young Charles enlisted in the Continental Army. A mere boy set out to risk his life in the defense of liberty, the liberty of a nation he hoped one day to live in as a free man. Little is known of his service, only that he served through the duration of the war. The courage he must have carried, we can only imagine. This is no doubt where this young boy's character was tested over and over again. When the war ended, Charles Bowles moved to New Hampshire, where he took up farming. A short time later, he married Mary Corliss, the granddaughter of Colonel Morgan. As with many blacks who dedicated their lives on the front lines of the Revolutionary War, Charles fought for freedom and the promise of a pension from the colonial governments. However, he came to realize just how fragile the economy of this new government was. Men like Charles carried with them memories of those hard-fought battles and the thanks of a grateful nation. But would it be enough to carry them forward? Many blacks developed a deep devotion to religion and a conviction to pursue a personal relationship with God through his son Jesus. This carried many of our founders through some of the darkest times of our nation's early history. However, where some men struggled to settle a civic violation, Charles related that his heart was weighed down with the thought of being unable to settle issues of rebellion against the King of Heaven. No matter what he did, he could not earn the peace he sought. After a hard-fought personal battle, Charles came to the fullness of his futility and surrendered his life to the power of the shed blood of Jesus and received forgiveness for his sin. Soon Charles was openly professing his newfound faith, was baptized, and joined the Calvinistic Baptist Church of Wentworth, New Hampshire. Charles brought this witness to the surrounding towns, but the Baptists were unpopular during this time in the state, as Congregationalism had exerted great influence over the general public. An interesting contrast developed when Bowles began to profess his faith. Many of those early reformers were compared to the crown exercising its authority to govern the colonies. Many colonialists still held to the roots of faith they had learned before leaving England. But at that time in history, the Baptists were threatening their traditions, and some saw this as a kind of tyranny. The Baptists, under the leadership of Roger Williams, were very successful, with conversions numbering in the thousands, opening up a new religious era in America. Bowles' desire to study Christian doctrine led him to withdraw from the Calvinistic Baptists and to align himself with the newly established Free Will Baptists, who believed in free grace, free salvation, and free will. It was at this time that he felt an urge to pursue the ministry of preaching the gospel. But he quickly shrunk back because of his limited education. He was so discouraged by his apparent deficiency for book learning that he escaped to the sea for a period of 3 years. While he was at sea, he engaged in many wicked behaviors, yet refused to renounce his salvation. During that third winter, a woman who Charles Bowles had never met before approached him and said that she had traveled 30 miles to tell him of a dream she had. She saw Charles in this dream, conducting a revival, and caused it to grow greatly. Under his current mental and spiritual condition, Charles chose to ignore her. Not long after the woman had appeared a second time, this time accompanied by her husband, hoping he could convince Charles of the importance of her mission. Their earnest request resulted in Charles Bowles attending and preaching at a meeting. He walked away, thinking himself a dismal failure. Yet the same husband and wife consoled him and appealed for him to return to a second appointment. On his way to that meeting, Charles decided to stop and pray for God's help. His humility moved heaven, and that night as he preached, both preacher and the hearer were moved by the power of God. That night, several people received Christ as Savior and witnessed the start of the ministry of Charles Bowles. Shortly after, Charles left for his home to prepare for his calling. After such preparation, he was licensed under the Baptist Conference and set out to preach among the Green Mountains and later in Ashburnham, Massachusetts. From 1808 to 1817, Elder Bowles, as he became known, found many an open door for the gospel. He then moved on for a season to Rhode Island. In one such town, a group of rabble, encouraged by libations, sought to rush into the revival meeting and throw this black preacher out of their town. Charles Bowles, knowing of their plans, called for the brethren to surround him and pray to God for deliverance. When the men entered the meeting room that night, they were stopped dead in their tracks by the power of God, and they fled. Keep in mind that this was a black preacher ministering to any and all who would listen, and they listened throughout Rhode Island. Charles Bowles ministered in New Hampshire, Rhode Island, Vermont, and like many a circuit rider, Charles would find himself traveling from town to town, late at night, hungry and penniless, not knowing where he would spend the night. On one such night, after humbly petitioning the God of heaven, Charles's horse walked by several homes and stopped right in front of one in particular. Upon requesting and being granted shelter to warm himself, a young child approached him and began to weep. Her mother took her aside, but upon entering the room again, she wept before him. She cried out, "Who are you? Are you hungry?" Such was the provision of God for this servant of God. Not only was he lodged and fed, but when the local Methodist minister did not arrive, Charles Bowles was asked to preach in his stead. Evidence upon evidence of this amazing American followed him wherever he traveled. The year was 1817 when Elder Bowles preached at Brother Simon Croc's house in Washington, stirring the hearts of many. That same year, he established churches in Duxbury and Shelburne, and later in Huntington, Vermont. Books could be written, and have, regarding the life and exploits of this courageous and deeply humble man of God. He preached to thousands over a period of some 40 years as a minister of the Free Will Baptist Connection, and he witnessed the faithfulness of God as many who heard his messages gave their lives to Jesus Christ. Charles Bowles, having finished his course, departed to his reward on March 16, 1843. Few details are available regarding the life of the next American hero, Salem Poor. The name of his parents are not recorded for us, and it appears they may have abandoned or sold him as a slave to a man named John Poor. Many slave owners treated their slaves like family, and in Salem's case, he was paid for his services, which he used to purchase his freedom for 27 pounds on July 10, 1769. Salem had a history of several marriages from August of 1771 to 1801, which led some to consider him a polygamist. His first wife was a free black woman named Nancy Parker, and on September 29, 1776, the Andover Historical Society recorded the baptism of their son Jonas. With the start of the Revolutionary War, Salem Poor enlisted in the militia and served under Captain Benjamin Ames in Colonel James Fry's regiment. In the Massachusetts State Archives, there is a petition to the General Court of Massachusetts Bay Colony. It describes the Battle of Charleston and a man under the service of Colonel Fry. The document read that a Negro man named Salem Poor behaved like an experienced officer, and that in this man centers a brave and gallant soldier. The date was December 1775, about 6 months after Bunker Hill. Of between 2,400 to 4,000 colonists who served in the battle, no other man was recognized for such a commendation. The hero of the Battle of Bunker Hill was Salem Poor of Andover, Massachusetts. Salem was sent along with his regiment to build a fort at Bunker Hill and other places nearby on the night of July 16, 1775. There are no details about what Poor did to earn such high praises by these officers. However, it is presumed that his deeds were too many to mention. Only reading to set forth the particulars of his conduct would be tedious. We would only beg leave to say that in the person of this said Negro centers a brave and gallant soldier. The reward due to so great a distinguished character we submit to the Congress. Among those credits to Salem was the death of British Lieutenant Colonel Abercrombie during the Battle of Bunker Hill. In John Trumbull's famous painting of Bunker Hill, General Warren had been fatally wounded in the center left of this picture, while Colonel Abercrombie is lying dead at his feet. Salem Poor may also have served at Saratoga and Monmouth and spent that awful winter in Valley Forge. In 1780, he married his second wife, Mary Twing, who was also a free black. It's not clear if he first divorced his first wife, only that in the Boston Gazette of 1785, there was an article which read, "He disowned Mary of all her debts and he forewarned all persons from trusting Mary. Salem Poor then married Sarah Stevens, a white woman, in 1787. Later, in 1799, Salem was jailed briefly for a breach of peace, and soon after he married his fourth wife in 1801. Salem Poor died and was laid to rest in 1802. It is estimated that upwards of 12,000 to 15,000 black Americans served as soldiers or seamen during the American Revolution. Most were slaves, but there were those who, being free, weighed the danger of losing that freedom to a more severe master, that of Great Britain. These men fought in the battles of Lexington, Concord, Ticonderoga, Monmouth, Princeton, all the way to the final battle of Yorktown. They suffered along with their white brothers at the Valley Forge as they crossed the Delaware with Washington. It is important to note that every colony except South Carolina and Georgia sent black men to fight alongside whites. In addition to the general contribution of these soldiers, there were entire regiments of blacks, such as the 1st Rhode Island Regiment, which formed after General Cook signed legislation on February 3rd, 1778, which promised to free every black man who enlisted in the war, finished his training, and upon his passing muster, he would be absolutely free. Not only were they promised their freedom, but every black, mulatto, or Indian man slave would receive all bounties, wages, and encouragements equal to any enlisting in the service of defending the colonies. In addition, in lieu of lost service to their owners, they too were promised a reimbursement for their loss. Many of these slaves had no prior experience with muskets or other weapons, but after 6 weeks of training were deemed battle ready. These men joined with the American and French troops at the Battle of Rhode Island, proving their mettle on August 29, 1778, when the black elite Rhode Island Regiment defeated 3 assaults by British troops in the Battle of Rhode Island at Newport. These brave men were the first all-black unit in the colonies and numbered less than 200 men. They fought under the Colonel James Varnum and Colonel Christopher Green. This regiment saw further service in Yorktown, including the night of October 14, 1781, when they took part in the assault and capture of Redoubt 10. The 1st Rhode Island Regiment was disbanded in 1783 when Congress decided to consolidate regiments under 500 men, and the state refused to spend additional funds to recruit. Even though the valiant efforts of such men gained the colonies a chance at freedom, slavery was not abolished. History records the numerous efforts of bravery and service and how long those men planted the seeds of emancipation for their black brothers about 80 years later. Men like Jack Erebus, who fought with the promise of freedom only to find his master's mind changed on the matter when he returned. Jack decided to run away, but he didn't get very far. Upon his capture, he was put in jail. But Jack's case came to the attention of a Yale-educated lawyer by the name of Chauncey Goodrich. Goodrich was so moved by this war hero's plight that he decided to defend Erebus and won him his freedom. The judge's decision in this case should have sent a shockwave through the colonies and a response to free those who had sacrificed so much. Instead, this matter did not affect the greater number of slaves whose masters denied them their freedom. The American Revolution saw the southern colonies as well as some in the north dealing with the hardship that resulted from a lack of able-bodied fighting men. While they watched, the British were struggling with their own shortages. The rumor of freedom granted for a black or an Indian slave joining the Crown's fight against the colonies surfaced in early 1775. Lord Dunmore, the royal governor of Virginia, was one of those who leaked such rumors. The British shared in the fear of many in the colonies that arming the blacks would result in slave rebellions. A few slaves took up the opportunity by running away and joining the British. The Spanish also, who were in Florida, were proclaiming the freedom card to lure black slaves out of the Carolinas and Georgia. The intent of this so-called promise was a divide and conquer strategy, and it worked. When the white slave owners from Georgia and South Carolina pursued and caught up with those slaves who had fled for freedom, it resulted in the death of many white and blacks alike. A great tragedy in the historic fight for our nation's freedom. In contrast, it is estimated that for every black man that joined the British, 10 joined the Continental Army. These brave men trained diligently and, in spite of poor treatment by some in leadership, resulted in history journaling the performance of many black soldiers and seamen who fought courageously, winning the respect of many a commander in the Continental Army. In spite of those who feared putting a rifle in the hands of a slave, the Revolutionary War saw such American men performing incredible acts of heroism that not only earned their freedom, but the thanks from a grateful nation. But the list of heroes does not end with these. William Flora was born the son of free black parents in the vicinity of Portsmouth, Virginia. Little is known of his life prior to the American Revolution, except that he was a successful businessman who owned and operated a prosperous livery stable. William joined the Continental Army and served as a private in Colonel William Woodford's 2nd Virginia Regiment. It was noteworthy that he furnished his own musket, which shows that he had earned the respect of his white neighbors to carry that musket, in spite of the colony's statutes which forbade blacks from bearing arms or serving in the militia. Among his accomplishments was his service at the Battle of the Great Bridge. Envision this, if you will. The setting of a narrow bridge was providing forces a crossing of the Elizabeth River, with a limited number of sentinels keeping watch over the bridge, and their only recourse were the 2 7-foot-high palisade walls called breastworks, approximately 1/4 mile and 1/2 mile behind them. Their duty was to provide early warning of the British advancing. In preparation of preventing the British from crossing that bridge, men had removed several of the bridge decking planks, making it impassable. The cold morning of December 9, 1775, William Flora was crouched down behind a pile of shingles among the remains of a burned-out building. The fog across this swampy marshland created an advantage for the British, but not one that went unnoticed. With the cold numbing his senses, William heard a noise. Lifting his head to peer over the pile of shingles, he saw something through the dimness of the dawning light. The British were replacing the wooden planks and making their way toward his outpost. Without hesitation, William raised his musket and fired. The other sentries simultaneously fired their muskets, and then they fired again. After 2 or 3 rounds were fired, the other sentries ran toward the rear causeway to safety and to alert the troops of the approaching attack. William alone stood his ground, firing again and again. 7 or 8 times he fired at the British as they advanced. Then he too rose from his hiding place and ran for the causeway. The British rifle fire was flying around him, and an occasional 4-pounder could be heard as he made his way to the safety of the first breastwork. He ran up the plank, and just as he crossed over, he pulled that plank up behind him to keep the enemy from gaining access to the causeway. Just then, Lieutenant Travis ordered the troops to make ready, take aim, and fire. As the British crossed the bridge and were now some 50 yards in front of them, a number of grenadiers fell to the ground, including Captain Charles Fortis. The captain rose to his feet and waved his hat in defiance, rallying his troops to advance. But no sooner had he uttered those words than 11 balls struck him and he dropped to the ground. The British returned musket fire, but suffered a great defeat that morning. Just then, reinforcements arrived, and some urged their commander, Colonel Woodford, to pursue and defeat the British. But wisely, the colonel stood his ground, realizing that had he advanced, the British would do likewise to them as they crossed that narrow bridge. William Flora, along with the other soldiers, that day could not have imagined the magnitude of their actions, affecting the entirety of the war. As a result, the British and Loyalist forces under Royal Governor Lord Dunmore were driven from Virginia, and for the next 5 years, that colony remained free from the influence of British presence. With Virginia's newfound freedom, it was able to supply the other colonies with men, arms, and munitions at critical periods, including supplying Washington's army with much needed support. William continued to serve, and as the war escalated in November of 1776, he enlisted in Captain William Grimes' 15th Virginia Regiment. He then shifted to the 11th Virginia and 5th Virginia for the rest of the war. When many of the Virginia line under General Benjamin Lincoln were captured in Charleston in 1780, William narrowly escaped capture. The actions of those brave sentinels and others who held the British in check that December morning led to freedom over the next 5 years and set up the means for the defeat of Lord Cornwallis in 1781. As the combined colonial and French forces pressed southward, they forced Cornwallis toward the sea, where the French fleet had blocked their retreat, and achieved his surrender. After the war, William Flora returned to civilian life and his success in the cartage and livery stable business. He prospered to the point where he purchased the freedom of his wife and 2 children. Then in 1784, he purchased 2 plots of land, which may well have become the first black American to own land in Portsmouth, Virginia. His prosperity afforded him the ability to buy and sell several houses and to pay taxes on 3 large wagons and 3 2-wheeled carriages along with 6 horses. In 1806, William submitted a claim for a land grant due to veterans of the Continental Army. His claim was supported by a written affidavit submitted by Thomas Matthew, the late colonel of the 15th Virginia Regiment, dated July 16, 1806. This document supported the high regard for which his commanding officer held him in the performance of his duty. In 1807, at the age of 52, William Flora responded when he heard of the attack on the frigate Chesapeake. Again, he answered the call to service. In 1812, serving as home guard during the Battle of Craney Island. The year was 1818 when William received a land grant of 100 acres in the Virginia Military District. Circa 1820, this brave man left his lifelong legacy of selfless service, and at a good old age, respected and honored by the people of Norfolk, Gosport, and Portman as a true hero of the American Revolution. In William C. Nell's 1855 book entitled The Colored Patriots of the American Revolution, we experienced an apt record of the courageous souls who served in the Continental Army. In the introduction offered by Harriet Beecher Stowe, she wrote in response to those who considered the color race as an enemy and as sometimes friends, as deficient in energy and courage, how some men thought their virtues to be principally negative. In considering the services of the colored patriots of the Revolution, we are to reflect upon them as far more magnanimous, because rendered to a nation which did not acknowledge them as citizens and as equals, and in whose interests and prosperity they had less at stake, it was not for their own land they fought, not even for a land which had adopted them, but a land which had enslaved them, and whose laws, even in freedom, oftener oppressed than protected. Bravery under such circumstances has a peculiar beauty and merit. As stated earlier, this lesson only scratches the surface of the depth and richness of Americans' black heritage. Our nation benefited from the courageous acts of men and women who sacrificed everything for the freedom of every man, woman, and child in the colonies. We owe our black brothers and sisters a great deal for their valor, their foresight, their fortitude and integrity of spirit, for the depth of their devotion unto the cause of freedom, for their faithfulness to God and country, for all Americans, regardless of the color of their skin. In closing, I extend my deepest gratitude for the knowledge of their contributions and look forward to future discoveries into the lives of many more of America's founders. Thank you for watching Redeeming the Fathers of America.